David Wells wiped sweat from his forehead and squinted across his fields under the orange glow of Verdania's twin suns. The harvest season was approaching, and his cornstalk stood tall and proud, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. Everything looked perfect except for one strange problem that had been bothering him for the past week. Near the eastern edge of his property stood an ancient oak tree, easily 300 years old according to the colony records. Its thick trunk and sprawling branches had weathered countless seasons and storms. David had always respected the old tree, often eating his lunch in its shade during the hottest days. But something very unusual was happening to it now. Every morning for the past 7 days, David discovered the same bizarre scene. A small creature, no bigger than his farm cat, was breathing fire at the exact same spot on the oak's trunk. The little being looked like something from old Earth fairy tales. Translucent scales that sparkled like captured starlight, delicate wings that hummed softly as they fluttered, and bright golden eyes that seemed far too intelligent for such a tiny creature. The first time David saw it, he thought he was hallucinating from too much sun exposure. Farm life on Verdania could be tough, and the twin suns sometimes played tricks on tired minds. But the creature was definitely real, and it kept coming back. What puzzled David most was the dragon's behavior. It would hover exactly 3 feet from the tree trunk, take a deep breath that made its small chest expand comically, then release a stream of silver-blue flames directly at the same charred spot. The fire would dance across the bark for several minutes while the creature chirped softly, almost like it was singing. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the little dragon would vanish into the sky. David tried everything to discourage his unusual visitor. He shouted at it, threw his hat in its direction, and even sprayed water from his irrigation hose. The dragon simply ignored him completely, continuing its daily ritual as if David didn't exist at all. The strangest part was what happened to the tree itself. Each morning, David found the oak's trunk blackened and charred in that one specific spot, about 4 feet from the ground. The burn mark was always the same size, roughly circular, maybe 2 feet across. The bark looked completely destroyed, cracked and smoking slightly. But by the next morning, the tree had somehow healed itself completely. David had lived on Verdania for 15 years, ever since the agricultural colony was established. He knew every plant species on this world, and none of them could regenerate that quickly. Oak trees were supposed to be slow-growing, sturdy things that took decades to recover from major damage. Yet this ancient tree was healing overnight from what should have been serious burns. Even more mysteriously, the area around the tree was thriving like never before. David's crops nearest to the oak were growing larger and healthier than anything else on his farm. The corn stalks stood 2 feet taller than normal, their ears fat and golden. Tomato plants nearby produced fruit the size of melons. The soil itself felt different, richer, more alive somehow. His neighbor, old Pete Martinez, who farmed the adjacent plot, had noticed the difference too. "Whatever you're doing over by that tree, David, you should bottle it and sell it," Pete had joked just yesterday. "My crops on the border between our properties are growing like crazy too. Haven't seen anything like it in all my years farming." David hadn't mentioned the dragon to Pete or anyone else in the colony. Who would believe such a ridiculous story? A magical fire-breathing creature that healed trees and improved soil. It sounded like something from children's books, not real life on a frontier agricultural world, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. Every morning brought the same routine. David would wake before dawn, check his fields, and find the dragon already at work on the oak tree. The creature seemed to follow a precise schedule, always finishing its fire-breathing ritual just as Verdania's twin suns crested the eastern mountains. David tried staying up all night once to catch the dragon arriving, but exhaustion overtook him around midnight. When he woke at sunrise, there was the little creature dutifully burning the tree as usual. The whole situation was driving him crazy with curiosity. David prided himself on being a practical man. He'd studied agricultural science at the Earth Colony University before volunteering for the Verdania settlement mission. He understood soil composition, plant biology, and farming techniques. Mystery creatures that defied all logic were definitely not part of his expertise, yet he couldn't deny what he was seeing with his own eyes. The dragon was real. The tree was healing impossibly fast, and his crops were thriving beyond anything in agricultural textbooks. Local wildlife seemed to sense something unusual. Too, David noticed that birds no longer nested in the oak tree's branches. Deer and rabbits that normally grazed near the tree line now gave the area a wide berth. Even his farm dog Rex refused to go anywhere near the oak after the dragon's visits began. The only creatures that seemed comfortable around the tree were beneficial insects, bees, butterflies, and pollinating. Beetles swarmed the area in unusual numbers. David had never seen such abundant insect activity, and it was definitely helping his nearby crops flourish one evening. As David sat on his porch reviewing agricultural reports, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would try something different. Instead of trying to chase the dragon away, he would observe it more carefully. Maybe if he understood what the creature was actually doing, he could figure out why it was so obsessed with that particular tree as he prepared for bed that night. David found himself wondering about the dragon's origins. Where did it come from? Why did it choose his farm? And most importantly, what was so special about that exact spot on the oak tree that required daily burning? Little did David know that his questions were about to lead him to discoveries that would change not just his understanding of Verdania, but humanity's place in the galaxy forever. The answers lay buried deep beneath the ancient oak, waiting patiently in the darkness for someone curious enough to dig deeper. And David Wells, practical farmer turned reluctant explorer, was about to become that someone. 3 weeks had passed since David first spotted the mysterious dragon, and his patience was wearing thin. The creature's daily ritual continued unchanged. Arrive at dawn, burn the same spot on the oak tree, disappear before breakfast. David had tried everything from setting up cameras to leaving offerings of food near the tree. The cameras mysteriously malfunctioned every time the dragon appeared, showing only static-filled images. Food offerings sat untouched until other wildlife eventually claimed them. But David's scientific mind refused to give up. This morning felt different somehow. The air carried an electric charge that made the hair on his arms stand up, and the dragon seemed more agitated than usual. Its normally melodic chirping sounded urgent, almost frantic, instead of the typical 3-minute burn session. The creature spent nearly an hour breathing silver-blue flames at the oak trunk. The fire burned hotter and brighter than ever before, and when it finally ended, the charred spot on the bark looked deeper than usual. David made his decision right then and there. "If you won't tell me what you're doing, little friend, maybe the tree will," he muttered, grabbing his shovel from the tool shed. The logical place to start digging was around the tree's root system. Maybe something underground was attracting the dragon's attention. Perhaps unusual mineral deposits or underground water sources were affecting the tree's growth and healing abilities. David began carefully excavating around the oak's massive root network, being cautious not to damage the ancient tree. The soil came away easily, almost too easily, as if it had been disturbed before. 2 feet down, his shovel struck something that definitely wasn't a root. The metallic clang echoed strangely, seeming to resonate much longer than it should have. David cleared away more dirt and exposed a smooth, dark surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Whatever he'd found was clearly artificial. David's heart raced as he continued digging, revealing more of the mysterious object. The surface was perfectly smooth, without any visible seams or markings, made from some kind of material he didn't recognize. Not metal, not stone, but something that felt warm to the touch despite being buried in cool earth. Above him, the dragon had returned and was hovering directly over the excavation site. Its golden eyes were fixed on David's work, and its chirping had taken on an entirely different tone, still musical but somehow more urgent, more communicative. "You know what this is, don't you?" David asked the creature. "This is what you've been trying to show me." The dragon's response was to land delicately on the edge of David's excavation and begin breathing gentle flames down at the exposed surface. The fire didn't burn David or damage the mysterious object. Instead, it seemed to activate something. Symbols began glowing faintly along the surface where the dragon's flames touched it. David stumbled backward in shock. The symbols were definitely not human in origin, nothing like any writing system he'd ever studied. They pulsed with soft light, appearing and disappearing in complex patterns that seemed almost alive. As he stared at the glowing markings, something incredible happened. David began to understand them, Not the specific meanings, but the concepts they represented. Numbers, star charts, mathematical formulas that were far beyond his agricultural training yet somehow made perfect sense to his mind. "What's happening to me?" he whispered, pressing his hands to his temples as new knowledge flooded his consciousness. The dragon chirped softly, almost sympathetically, then resumed its flame treatment of the buried object. More symbols appeared with each breath of fire, creating an intricate network of glowing lines across what David was beginning to realize was a much larger structure. By late afternoon, David had exposed nearly 10 feet of the object's surface. It wasn't just buried, it was enormous, extending far beyond what he could excavate with hand tools. The smooth surface curved away into darkness, suggesting something the size of a building or even larger. The dragon had remained with him throughout, the day seeming to approve of his progress. Occasionally it would guide his digging by breathing fire at specific spots, always revealing new clusters of symbols that filled David's mind with alien knowledge. That evening, David sat exhausted beside his excavation, trying to process what he'd learned. The knowledge flowing into his mind wasn't random. It was purposeful, organized, like someone was carefully teaching him. Star charts showed systems he'd never heard of. Mathematical equations described forces beyond current human physics. And underneath it all was a growing certainty that this discovery would change everything. But change it how? And why was this knowledge being given to him, a simple farmer on a frontier colony world? The dragon perched on the oak's lowest branch, watching David with those impossibly intelligent golden eyes. In the fading light of Verdania's twin suns, its translucent scales seemed to glow with inner fire. "You're not really a dragon, are you?" David said quietly. "You're something else entirely, something that's been waiting for someone to find this thing." The creature's only response was a soft, almost musical trill that somehow conveyed both sadness and hope as David walked back to his farmhouse that night, his mind churning with alien equations and star maps. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being prepared for something. The knowledge in his head felt incomplete, like pieces of a vast puzzle that he'd only just begun to assemble behind him. The dragon resumed its position over the excavation site, breathing steady flames down into the exposed surface. The symbols glowed brighter in response, painting the ancient oak in shifting patterns of light and shadow. David dreams that night were filled with images of vast cities floating among the stars, beings of pure energy dancing through cosmic storms, and a growing sense of urgency that he couldn't quite understand. When he woke before dawn, one thought dominated his mind. He needed to dig deeper. Much deeper. Whatever lay buried beneath his farm was enormous, and the dragon, or whatever it really was, clearly wanted him to find all of it. David had no idea that his next day of excavation would reveal something that would terrify him to his very core, something that would force him to understand why the dragon had chosen his farm, his tree, and ultimately him. The truth was buried just a few feet deeper, waiting patiently in the darkness for a curious farmer to uncover secrets that the galaxy had forgotten for millions of years. David spent the entire next week excavating with renewed determination. He'd borrowed heavy equipment from the colony's construction depot, telling the supervisor he was installing a new irrigation system. The lie came easily. How could he possibly explain the truth? The buried structure was massive beyond anything he'd imagined. What had started as a small dig around the oak tree's roots had expanded into a crater nearly 30 feet across. The smooth, dark surface continued in every direction he excavated, curving downward like the hull of some enormous vessel buried deep in Verdania's soil. The dragon, David had started thinking of his mysterious companion as Spark, never left the excavation site now. It perched on various points around the crater's edge, breathing continuous streams of silver-blue fire at newly exposed sections of the structure. Each flame revealed more of those strange, glowing symbols, and with each new symbol, David's understanding grew. He now knew with absolute certainty that this was a ship, but not like any vessel humans had ever built. The technology was so advanced it seemed almost magical, incorporating principles of physics that human science hadn't even theorized yet. More disturbing were the star charts now burned into his memory. They showed Verdania's system as it existed, millions of years ago, long before human colonists ever arrived. Whatever race had built this ship, they'd been here when Verdania was a completely different world. On the 7th day of heavy excavation, David's digger broke through into open space. The machine's drill bit suddenly dropped several feet, and compressed air hissed up through the hole with a sound like ancient sighs. David shut off the equipment and peered down into the darkness below. He'd found an entrance spark, immediately flew down to the opening and began breathing fire into the depths. The flames illuminated what appeared to be a vast corridor stretching. Away into darkness, the walls were lined with the same glowing symbols, but these were different, more complex, almost urgent in their pulsing patterns. David lowered himself through the opening with climbing rope and a portable light. The corridor was enormous, easily large enough to drive his farm truck through. The wall stretched up 20 feet to a curved ceiling that seemed to absorb his flashlight beam. Everything was made from that same dark, warm material that felt alive under his touch. As he walked deeper into the structure, following sparks, dancing flames, David's enhanced understanding began translating the wall symbols. They weren't just decorative. They were warnings, instructions, and something that chilled him to the bone. Security protocols. This wasn't just a ship. It was a prison. The corridor opened into a vast chamber that took David's breath away. Hundreds of cylindrical containers lined the walls, stretching up into darkness beyond his light's reach. Each container was roughly human-sized and made from the same translucent material as Spark's scales. Most of the containers were dark and empty, but some still hummed with faint energy. David approached one of the active containers and nearly dropped his flashlight in shock. Inside, barely visible through the translucent walls, was a shadowy form, vaguely humanoid but wrong in ways that made his mind recoil. The thing inside the container pulsed slowly, as if breathing. Dark tendrils writhed beneath what might have been skin, and occasionally it twitched as if dreaming of terrible things. "Stasis chambers," David whispered, his voice echoing in the enormous space. "These are prisoners." Spark landed on his shoulder and chirped urgently, pointing with one tiny claw toward the chamber's center. David followed the dragon's guidance to find something that made his enhanced understanding crystallize into pure terror. A massive crystalline structure dominated the center of the chamber, easily 40 feet tall and pulsing with the same silver-blue energy as Spark's flames. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, throwing dancing shadows across hundreds of stasis containers. This was the prison's heart, its power source and control system, and it was failing David's alien-enhanced knowledge. Let him read the crystal's status displays, and what he learned made his blood turn to ice. The containment systems were operating at less than 30% capacity. Power levels had been dropping steadily for centuries, and several stasis chambers showed critical failure warnings. Some of the prisoners were beginning to wake up. "What are they?" David asked Spark, though he somehow already knew the answer would be terrifying. The dragon's response came not in chirps, but directly into David's mind. Images, emotions, and terrible understanding flooded his consciousness. The Devourers. Spark's mental voice was ancient beyond human comprehension. Enemies of all life, consumers of worlds. They turned entire galaxies into lifeless husks before my people stopped them. David staggered under the weight of the knowledge being shared. He saw flashes of cosmic battles fought across multiple dimensions, worlds stripped of all life in minutes, entire star systems going dark as these creatures fed Spark's people. Beings of pure energy who could take any form had fought the Devourers for millennia. The war had raged across the galaxy until finally, at terrible cost, they'd managed to capture the last of the enemy and imprison them on remote worlds. Verdania was one of those prison worlds. "We were the Guardians," Spark continued, showing David images of energy, beings like itself maintaining containment systems across thousands of worlds. "We kept the prisons strong, the Devourers sleeping, the galaxy safe. But the Guardians were dying out, their energy forms gradually fading over millions of years. One by one, the prison worlds lost their protectors, their containment systems slowly failing. Spark was one of the last Guardians, desperately maintaining this one prison through daily flame treatments that recharged the failing crystal core, but it wasn't enough anymore. David realized with growing horror that his farming activities had been making things worse. The electromagnetic fields from his irrigation systems, the chemical runoff from fertilizers, even the vibrations from his heavy machinery. All of it had been gradually disrupting the prison's ancient systems. Humanity had unknowingly been sabotaging their own protection. "How many are in here?" David asked, looking around at the hundreds of stasis chambers. "Too many." Spark replied sadly. "If even one fully awakens, it will consume all life on Verdania in days. If they all wake up, they'll spread to other worlds. The galaxy will burn again." Several of the nearest stasis chambers were showing red warning lights now. Cracks appeared in their translucent walls, and the shadowy forms inside were moving more frequently. David felt panic rising in his chest. "How long do we have?" The answer came, not from Spark but from the prison itself. One of the failing stasis chambers suddenly blazed with alarms as its containment field collapsed completely. The translucent wall dissolved like mist, and the creature inside began to unfold itself into reality. David got his first clear look at a devourer as it emerged from its million-year sleep, and the sight nearly shattered his sanity. The thing was darkness given form, not absence of light, but active, hungry darkness that seemed to consume photons as they touched it. It had no fixed shape, constantly shifting between barely humanoid forms and writhing masses of shadow. Tendrils of pure void lashed out from its body, and everything they touched simply ceased to exist. The air around it grew thick and oppressive, making breathing difficult. David's flashlight dimmed and flickered as the creature's presence drained energy from everything nearby. But worst of all were its eyes, points of anti-light that hurt to look at directly, filled with an intelligence that was utterly alien and completely malevolent. The devourer turned those terrible eyes toward David, and he felt his life force being pulled toward the creature like water down a drain. This was what the dragon had been trying to prevent. This was the terror that lay sleeping beneath his peaceful farm. This was why the Guardians had sacrificed themselves across millions of years. And now, because of human ignorance and a failing ancient prison, it was waking up. David realized with crystal clarity that everything he thought he knew about humanity's place in the galaxy was about to change forever. David scrambled backward as the devourer fully emerged from its broken stasis chamber, his boots slipping on the smooth floor of the ancient prison. The creature towered above him, its shifting form reaching nearly 10 feet in height. Tendrils of living darkness writhing where arms and legs should be. Spark flew between David and the awakening horror, breathing the most intense flames David had ever seen. The silver-blue fire seemed to actually hurt the devourer, causing it to recoil with a sound like tearing metal mixed with dying stars. But even as Spark fought to protect him, David could see the little guardian was hopelessly outmatched. The dragon's flames, which had seemed so powerful when recharging the prison's crystal core, barely slowed the ancient enemy. More alarms began wailing throughout the vast chamber, as other stasis pods started showing critical failure warnings. Red lights flashed from dozens of containers, and hairline cracks appeared in their translucent walls. David's enhanced understanding translated the prison's automated warnings with terrifying clarity. Complete containment failure was imminent. The knowledge Spark had shared was flooding back to him now. Memories of worlds stripped bare by these creatures. Entire civilizations consumed in hours. Stars themselves dimming as the devourers fed on their energy. And this was just one prison among thousands scattered across the galaxy. David watched in horror as the freed devourer extended a tendril toward one of the prison walls. Where the darkness touched the ancient material, it simply vanished, not destroyed or dissolved, but completely erased from existence as if it had never been there at all. "How do we stop it?" David shouted over the increasing alarms. Spark's mental voice was strained with effort as the dragon continued breathing defensive flames. "We cannot stop them, only contain them. My people learned this after losing entire star systems trying to fight them directly." The devourer seemed to realize it was no longer fully contained. Its eyeless face turned upward toward the ceiling, sensing the way David had entered the prison. It began moving with terrifying purpose toward the corridor that led to the surface to David's farm, to Verdania's surface, where millions of colonists lived in complete ignorance of the threat beneath their feet. There has to be something, David insisted, his mind racing through the alien knowledge he'd absorbed. Your people built this prison. They must have included emergency protocols. The knowledge came to him even as he spoke. Buried deep in the flood of information Spark had shared were fragments of Guardian emergency procedures. Most were beyond his understanding, requiring energy manipulation abilities that only the Guardian species possessed. But there was one protocol designed for exactly this situation. Guardian Local Species Cooperation. David's enhanced understanding suddenly blazed with new comprehension. The prison hadn't been designed to run indefinitely on Guardian power alone. It was meant to be maintained by whatever intelligent species evolved on each prison world. The Guardians had always intended for local life forms to eventually take over maintenance duties. They just hadn't expected it to take millions of years for intelligence to evolve on most prison worlds. Spark, David called out. The cooperation protocols. You can teach me to interface with the prison systems directly. The dragon's flames faltered for a moment as hope flickered in its golden eyes. Yes, but the process is dangerous for non-energy beings. Your biological form might not survive the neural link. David looked at the advancing devourer, then at the dozens of failing stasis chambers around the vast room. If he did nothing, the creatures would reach the surface within hours. Once free, in Verdania's atmosphere, they would consume every living thing on the planet before spreading to other worlds. Do it, he said firmly. Show me how to connect to the prison. Spark flew to the massive crystal core at the chamber's center, chirping urgently for David to follow. The dragon landed on a section of the crystal that began glowing with concentrated symbols. Not the passive markings David had seen before, but active interface nodes. Place your hands here. Spark's mental voice was urgent. I will guide the connection, but once it begins, you must maintain contact no matter how painful it becomes. David pressed his palms against the warm crystal surface and immediately felt electricity surge through his nervous system. The sensation was like being struck by lightning while diving into an ocean of pure information. His consciousness exploded outward, suddenly connected to every system in the massive prison. He could feel the failing stasis chambers like infected wounds, sense the weakening containment fields as physical pain, monitor power levels that dropped with each passing second. More terrifyingly, he could feel the devourers themselves. Cold spots of absolute hunger that registered like frostbite in his expanded awareness. But along with the connection came understanding. David realized that his years of farming experience were actually perfect preparation for this moment. Managing a prison full of dormant enemies was just agriculture on a cosmic scale. Monitoring conditions, maintaining proper environmental controls, preventing contamination. The prison's biomechanical systems responded to agricultural principles. Because the Guardians had designed them that way, I understand now. David whispered, his hands still pressed against the crystal interface. This isn't just a prison, it's a farm for keeping dangerous crops safely contained. Through the neural link, he felt Spark's surprise and growing excitement. Yes, you see it. The Guardians knew that biological minds think differently than energy beings. We maintain through constant vigilance, but biological species maintain through systematic cultivation. David's farming knowledge merged with the alien prison systems, creating new possibilities the Guardians had never imagined. Instead of just containing the devourers, the prison could be modified to actively suppress them, turning their own energy-draining abilities against each other. He began implementing changes to the containment fields, using principles of crop, rotation and pest management scaled up to cosmic proportions. The failing stasis chambers could be reinforced by redistributing power loads, just like managing irrigation across different field sections. The escaped devourer suddenly stopped its advance toward the corridor. It turned back toward the crystal core, sensing that something fundamental was changing in the prison's operation. Its terrible anti-light eyes fixed on David, and for the first time since awakening, the creature showed something that might have been concern. David felt the prison systems responding to his biological approach to the problem. Power efficiency increased as loads were balanced properly. Containment fields strengthened as energy was redirected from failing systems to critical ones. But most importantly, he was learning to turn the prison from a passive container into an active suppression system. The devourer began moving toward him again, but its advance was slower now, more cautious. The creature could sense that the nature of its imprisonment was changing in ways it didn't understand. "Spark," David said through gritted teeth as the neural connection burned through his nervous system. "How many other prison worlds are out?" "There, thousands," the dragon replied. "Most have lost their guardians. Their prisons are failing just like this one was." David felt a new determination surge through him. If he could make this work, if he could prove that humans could maintain these ancient prisons using agricultural principles, then humanity could take over guardian duties across the galaxy. It would mean revealing the truth to his own species, convincing them to accept responsibility for protecting all galactic life. But it would also mean the end of the Guardians' million-year vigil. "Are you ready to teach humans how to be guardians?" David asked. Spark's mental voice carried both exhaustion and hope. "We have been alone for so long. If your species can truly learn to maintain the prisons, then perhaps we can finally rest." The escaped devourer had reached the crystal core now, its darkness beginning to drain energy from the systems David was trying to repair. But instead of panicking, David drew on every bit of farming experience he'd ever gained. Time to show this ancient horror what human stubbornness could accomplish. David gripped the crystal interface tighter as the devourer's tendrils reached toward him, its touch promising complete obliteration. Through the neural link, he could feel the ancient creature's hunger, like a physical weight crushing down on his consciousness. But David Wells had spent 15 years coaxing life from Verdania's stubborn soil, dealing with crop failures, equipment breakdowns, and weather that seemed personally determined to destroy his harvests. He wasn't about to be intimidated by some cosmic parasite. "You want to feed on energy," he growled at the approaching darkness. "Let me show you what happens when a farmer controls the food supply." Through the prison systems, David began implementing the most aggressive crop management technique he knew: controlled starvation. Instead of trying to pour more power into the failing containment fields, he started systematically cutting energy to non-essential systems. The devourer's hunger, which had been draining power from the crystal core, suddenly found itself feeding on nothing but empty circuits. The creature recoiled as if burned, its form flickering and losing cohesion. It had been feeding steadily for the few minutes since its awakening, growing stronger with each joule of energy it consumed. Now, cut off from its power source, it began to weaken. David felt Spark's amazement through their shared connection. "Brilliant. We never thought to starve them. We only knew how to contain them." "That's because you think like guardians," David replied, sweat pouring down his face from the strain of the neural interface. "I think like a farmer, and farmers know that controlling the food supply controls everything else." Through the prison's sensors, David could monitor the devourer's condition as it grew weaker. The creature was essentially a living energy converter. It consumed power and used that energy to exist in normal space. Cut off from its food source, it was being forced back into a dormant state. But David wasn't finished with his agricultural approach to cosmic horror. He began rerouting power through the prison systems in carefully planned cycles, creating what farmers called fallow periods, times when fields were left unplanted to restore soil nutrients. By cycling power to different sections of the prison in sequence, he could keep most systems running while ensuring that any devourers that managed to partially awaken would find themselves in dead zones with no energy to sustain themselves. The weakened devourer made one last desperate lunge toward the crystal core, but David was ready. He redirected all available power to the suppression fields around the creature, not to contain it, but to create a localized energy vacuum. The ancient horror simply collapsed in on itself, its form dissolving as it was forced back into hibernation. "One, down," David muttered, checking the status of the other failing stasis chambers. Several dozen to go. But the real test came when the prison's automated systems began responding to his farming-based modifications. Instead of simply maintaining the status quo, the facility started actively improving its own efficiency. David watched in amazement as power consumption dropped by 30%, while containment effectiveness increased. The prison was learning. From his biological approach, adapting Guardian technology to work with human agricultural principles. It's working. Spark's mental voice was filled with wonder. Your biological methods are making the prison stronger than it has been in millennia. That's what humans do, David replied, feeling a surge of species pride despite his exhaustion. We take broken systems and figure out how to make them work better. Through the neural link, David began accessing other prison facilities scattered across the galaxy. Most were in critical condition, their Guardian protectors long since faded to nothing, their containment systems failing after millions of years of neglect. But now he could see possibilities that the energy-based Guardians had never imagined human. Colonies were already spreading across dozens of worlds. If some of those worlds happened to contain ancient prisons, then human settlers could be taught to maintain them using agricultural techniques. Spark, David said, his voice growing stronger as he fully embraced his new role. How would you feel about humans becoming the new Guardians? The dragon's response was immediate and emotional. It would be the greatest gift imaginable. My people have been alone for so long, dying one by one as we maintain the prisons. If humans can take over our duties, then perhaps the last of us can finally find peace. David began designing a new protocol for the prison systems, one that integrated human farming knowledge with Guardian energy manipulation. The result was something neither species could have achieved alone. Instead of requiring constant attention from energy beings, the modified prisons would function like vast underground farms. Human caretakers would tend them using familiar agricultural principles, monitoring conditions, adjusting nutrient flows, and preventing contamination. The devourers would remain safely contained, not just by force, but by being systematically starved through controlled resource management. As David worked through the night, implementing his hybrid system, he felt the prison settling into a new operational pattern. Power levels stabilized at higher efficiency than they'd maintained in thousands of years. Failing stasis chambers began repairing themselves, and the entire facility hummed with renewed vitality. But perhaps most importantly, David felt the burden lifting from Spark's consciousness. For the first time in millions of years, the little Guardian wasn't alone in maintaining the prison. By dawn, David had successfully converted the ancient facility from a failing Guardian monument into a thriving, human-operated containment farm. The devourers remained safely imprisoned, but now their captivity was sustainable indefinitely. "It's done," David announced, finally removing his hands from the crystal interface. The neural link dissolved, leaving him exhausted but triumphant. Spark landed on his shoulder, the dragon's scales glowing brighter than David had ever seen them. "Thank you." The Guardian's mental voice carried emotions too complex for human understanding. "You have given my people hope for the first time in eons." David looked around the vast chamber, seeing it now not as a tomb for ancient horrors, but as the first farm in humanity's new agricultural empire. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We're going to need to contact the other colonies, set up training programs, figure out which worlds have prisons that need human caretakers. The work ahead would be enormous, convincing humanity to accept responsibility for galactic security, training farmers to become cosmic guardians, establishing new colonies specifically to tend ancient prisons." But David had never been one to back down from a challenge, especially when it involved making something grow where others had failed above them. Morning light filtered down through the excavation opening, and David realized he needed to return to the surface. His regular life as a simple farmer was over, but his new career as humanity's first prison farm administrator was just beginning. 6 months after David's life-changing discovery beneath the ancient oak tree, Verdania had become the unlikely headquarters for humanity's newest and most important profession: prison farm management. The old oak still stood in the center of what was now a carefully maintained facility, but it was no longer alone. Dozens of similar farms had been established across human space as colonists discovered that their lucky agricultural sites were actually built on top of ancient Guardian prisons. David stood in the newly constructed training center, watching the latest group of volunteer farmers learn to interface with crystalline control systems, that predated human civilization by millions of years. These men and women came from agricultural colonies across the galaxy, drawn by humanity's call to become protectors of all galactic life. Remember, David told the trainees, you're not just maintaining a prison, you're tending the most important crops in the galaxy, safety and peace. His assistant instructor was Sarah Kim, a former wheat farmer from the Kepler colonies who had shown remarkable aptitude for Guardian technology. She demonstrated the proper hand placement on a training crystal, while Spark and 3 other Guardian dragons provided encouragement and guidance. The little energy beings had multiplied somehow after David's success, or perhaps word had spread. Among the surviving Guardians that help had finally arrived. Now nearly a dozen of the crystalline creatures worked alongside human farmers, sharing millions of years of prison maintenance knowledge. The key is thinking biologically, Sarah explained to the trainees. These devourers are like invasive pests that we're keeping under controlled conditions. We don't destroy them. We manage them. David smiled as he watched the training session. The integration of human agricultural science with Guardian energy manipulation had exceeded even his most optimistic projections. Human-tended prisons were operating at 90% efficiency compared to the 30% they'd managed under failing Guardian maintenance. More importantly, the hybrid systems were self-improving, constantly adapting and optimizing their operations. But the real breakthrough had come when human engineers started studying Guardian crystal technology. Dr. Robert Chen, leading the research team at the new Galactic Prison Administration headquarters, had discovered that Guardian crystals could be cultivated like living organisms. Human farmers were now growing new control crystals using techniques adapted from mushroom cultivation. And crystal farming David, Dr. Chen approached him with a tablet full of exciting data. The latest reports from the Centauri farms show remarkable progress. They've successfully upgraded 3 ancient prisons to full human operational standards, and they're reporting a 15% increase in containment effectiveness. David nodded, pleased but not surprised. Human stubbornness and agricultural innovation were proving to be exactly what the galaxy needed. Any word from the deep space survey teams? He asked. That's the really exciting news, Dr. Chen grinned. The astronomical survey has identified over 3,000 worlds that show Guardian energy signatures. Most of them appear to be prison sites, and many are in systems that human expansion was already planning to explore. David felt a familiar surge of species pride. Humanity wasn't just stumbling into their role as galactic protectors. They were embracing it with characteristic human enthusiasm for solving complex problems. Irony wasn't lost on him. That humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization was their skill at farming and prison management. Not faster than light travel, not advanced weapons, not even diplomatic genius. Just good old-fashioned agricultural know-how applied to cosmic-scale problems, sir, one of the trainees called out. The Guardian is showing me something strange in the crystal interface. David walked over to examine the training setup. Spark was hovering near the student's hands, chirping urgently while complex symbols flowed across the crystal's surface. Through his own neural link training, David could read the Guardian's communication. New prisoners incoming. Different type. Need immediate consultation. What does that mean? The trainee asked nervously. David's enhanced understanding translated the symbols with growing concern and excitement. It means the Guardians weren't just fighting one type of enemy. There were multiple species of cosmic threats, and some of them are still out there. Dr. Chen leaned in to study the crystal display. Are you saying there are active threats still roaming the galaxy? Spark's mental voice reached all the humans simultaneously. Not roaming, returning. The Devourers were just the first wave of an ancient invasion. Their masters fled when we imprisoned the advance forces, but they have been gathering strength in the dark spaces between galaxies. The training room fell silent as the implications sank in. How long until they return? David asked. Spark consulted with the other Guardian dragons before responding. Perhaps decades, perhaps centuries. But when they come, they will bring forces far more terrible than the Devourers. David looked around at the assembled farmers, researchers, and Guardian allies. A year ago, he'd been a simple agricultural colonist worried about crop yields and irrigation schedules. Now he was helping to prepare humanity for a cosmic war against enemies that had once threatened all galactic life. "Well," he said finally, addressing both the humans and guardians present, "I guess we'd better start planning bigger farms." The response was immediate and enthusiastic. These were farmers, after all, and farmers were never intimidated by the prospect of bigger crops. To 10 Dr. Chen was already making notes about expansion protocols. "We'll need to accelerate the colony program, establish prison farms in every major system, train thousands more guardian human teams." Sarah Kim nodded agreement. "And we'll need to start developing new containment techniques for whatever's coming." The Devourers were just practice. David watched his colleagues and trainees embrace this new challenge with characteristic human optimism. They weren't thinking about the dangers or the impossibility of the task ahead. They were thinking about solutions, about how to turn cosmic threats into manageable agricultural problems. Spark landed on David's shoulder, the Guardian's scales shimmering, with what David had learned to recognize as contentment. "Your species amazes us." Most civilizations would despair at such news. Humans immediately begin planning how to farm it. "That's what we do," David replied, scratching the dragon gently behind its crystalline head. "We take impossible problems and turn them into successful harvests." Outside the training center, construction crews were already breaking ground for expanded facilities. Prison Farm Academy was growing rapidly as word spread through human space about their new role as galactic guardians. The ancient oak tree that had started it all stood in the center of the complex, its branches now home to a dozen guardian dragons, who sang crystalline harmonies in the evening breeze. The tree's trunk still bore the circular mark where Spark had burned it for weeks, but now the mark was surrounded by a bronze plaque. It read simply, "Here began humanity's greatest harvest." David smiled as he read the inscription. 6 months ago, he'd been annoyed by a small dragon burning his tree. Now he was helping to prepare his entire species for challenges that spanned galaxies, but at its core, it was still just farming. Tend the crops, manage the pests, prepare for the next growing season. Even if those crops happened to be cosmic prisons and the pests were ancient enemies of all life, David Wells, former simple farmer, current director of Galactic Prison Agriculture, was ready to get back to work after all. There was a whole galaxy to cultivate.